My bio family tried to steal my trust fund because I should share it with my real family. My adoptive dad destroyed them all. When I was 9, my adoptive parents, Tom and Linda, moved our family from the US to the UK for Tom's job. They'd adopted me as a baby and raised me alongside their biological son, Daniel. Before the move, they set up a trust fund for both Daniel and me, equal amounts for when we turned 21 or needed help with housing or education. They wanted us to have security no matter what happened. The solicitors managing it had strict protocols, including security questions only I could answer, things about my childhood, my adoptive parents' details, and our life in the US. Tom and Linda would check in with Mr. Whitmore every few months to make sure everything was properly managed. When I was 17, my biological parents reached out through social services, wanting to meet me. Tom and Linda supported my decision to connect with them, but stayed protective. The bio family lived in Manchester, parents Ava and Keith, and 3 kids they'd kept, twins Jason and Riley, who were 20, and Chloe, who was 14. They gave this whole sob story about being too young when they had me, but somehow managed to keep the 3 kids they had right after. I tried building relationships with them for years while Tom and Linda watched nervously. The bio family always seemed weirdly interested in my adoptive parents' money. They'd ask about Tom's banking job, our house in Surrey, and where Daniel and I went to school. Ava would drop comments about how lucky I was to be raised rich while they struggled. Keith would joke about my sharing the wealth with my real family. The twins would hint about needing help with university costs. Chloe just glared at me like I'd stolen her life. Last month, I got a call from Mr. Whitmore himself. He said there'd been multiple attempts to access my trust fund in the past week. First, someone claiming to be me called, saying I needed £30,000 for a family emergency. When security questions were asked, they put him on hold, and he could hear multiple people whispering in the background. They got every question wrong and hung up. Then Ava called, pretending to be Linda, my adoptive mother, saying she needed to authorize a release for me. Except she pronounced Linda's maiden name wrong and didn't know Tom's middle name. Mr. Whitmore knew immediately it wasn't Linda because he'd spoken to the real Linda that morning about Daniel's trust disbursement. The third attempt was Keith calling as Tom, which was ridiculous because Mr. Whitmore knew Tom's voice after 15 years. Keith tried deepening his voice but didn't know basic details like when the trust was established or what bank Tom worked for. He got aggressive when questioned and threatened to move the trust to another firm. The real Tom would never act that unprofessionally. But the bio family didn't stop there. The twins created fake email addresses similar to mine and sent requests for emergency funds. Chloe showed up at Whitmore & Associates' office pretending to be me, but the receptionist knew what I looked like from previous visits. She was escorted out by security. They even had Ava's sister Helen call pretending to be a hospital administrator, saying I was in critical condition and needed treatment funds. Mr. Whitmore called Tom and Linda immediately. They were furious and called me to make sure I was safe. When I explained the bio family's money obsession over the years, Tom lost it. He'd always been calm, measured, the kind of dad who never raised his voice. But hearing that the people I'd tried to bond with were just after the money he'd saved for me changed something. Tom took time off work and hired a private investigator. Within a week, the investigator found that the whole bio family was in serious debt. Ava and Keith owed $40,000 on failed business ventures. The twins had massive student loans and gambling debts. Chloe had been caught shoplifting 3 times. They'd planned the whole thing as a family, thinking they could get the money before anyone noticed. They'd even researched what my trust was worth by finding old public records from Tom's financial disclosures at his bank. Tom didn't just want them stopped. He wanted them destroyed. He called his contacts at every major bank in Manchester and informed them about the attempted fraud. Keith worked at a small accounting firm that did business with Tom's bank. Tom pulled all contracts. Keith was fired within days. Ava was a receptionist at a medical practice. Tom knew the practice owner through golf. When he heard about Ava impersonating a patient's mother to steal money, she was gone too. The twins worked at the same restaurant. Tom's colleague owned the chain. They were both terminated for theft after the owner suddenly decided to check the till cameras more carefully. Chloe's university got an anonymous tip about her shoplifting record that she'd hidden on her application. She lost her spot in the design program. But Tom wasn't done. He called me into his study that evening, closing the door behind us with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. The room smelled like leather and old books, familiar and safe, but Tom's expression was something I'd never seen before. He sat down across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and started listing names. Banking contacts in Manchester, the owner of Keith's accounting firm, the medical practice where Ava worked, the restaurant chain employing the twins. Each name came with a specific plan, delivered in this cold, steady voice that made my stomach twist. He explained exactly how he'd pull contracts, make calls, ensure each person in that family lost everything they had. He wanted me to understand this wasn't about stopping the fraud. This was about making sure they never recovered from trying to steal from me. I sat there watching him tick through his mental checklist like he was planning a business merger, not destroying 5 people's lives. Part of me wanted to tell him to stop, that this was too much, that we should just let the police handle it. But then I remembered Ava practicing Linda's voice, Keith researching my trust fund value, all 5 of them sitting around planning how to steal money Tom and Linda had saved for me. My hands started shaking in my lap. Tom noticed and reached over to squeeze my shoulder, his face softening for just a second before going hard again. He said they'd made this choice when they decided to target his daughter. Every word he spoke made my chest feel tighter, like I couldn't quite get enough air. He kept going, explaining how Keith's firm couldn't afford to lose Tom's bank as a client, how the practice owner owed Tom favors from their golf games, how his colleague at the restaurant chain would review security footage if Tom asked. The connections kept coming. This whole web of professional relationships I'd never really thought about. Tom worked in banking for over 20 years, knew everyone who mattered in the financial sector across northern England. He could make one phone call and end someone's career. I felt sick realizing how much power he actually had, power he'd never used for anything except protecting our family. Now he was using all of it like a weapon, systematic and precise. My throat felt tight and I couldn't tell if I wanted to cry or throw up. Linda appeared in the doorway, must have heard us talking and came to sit beside me on the sofa. She took my hand without saying anything, her fingers warm and steady against mine. Tom looked at both of us and asked if I understood why he had to do this. I nodded because I did understand, even though understanding didn't make the sick feeling go away. Linda's thumb rubbed circles on the back of my hand, while Tom pulled out his phone and started making calls right there in front of us. The first call was brief, professional, Tom's banking voice talking about contract reviews and compliance concerns. He hung up and made another call, this one to someone he called mate, talking about golf and mentioning he'd heard some concerning things about fraud attempts. Linda's hand tightened on mine. Tom made 4 more calls in the next 20 minutes, each one carefully worded, never directly saying what he wanted, but making it crystal clear anyway. I watched him work through his contact list like he was checking items off a shopping list. When he finally put the phone down, he looked at me and said Keith would be gone by morning. The firm couldn't risk their relationship with Tom's bank over one accountant, especially one involved in attempted fraud. My stomach churned, but I just nodded again. We sat there in the study for another hour while Tom explained the rest of his plan, Linda holding my hand the whole time, neither of them asking if I wanted this to happen because we all knew it already was happening. The next morning, I woke up to Tom on a phone call in the kitchen, his voice carrying up the stairs. I came down still in my pajamas and found him standing by the window, phone pressed to his ear, nodding at whatever the person on the other end was saying. He glanced at me and held up one finger. Almost done. Linda was making tea, moving quietly around the kitchen like she didn't want to disturb him. I sat at the table and she pushed a mug toward me without asking if I wanted one. Tom finished his call and turned around, something satisfied in his expression that made my chest feel weird. Keith was terminated an hour ago. The accounting firm had called an emergency meeting at 8 in the morning, reviewed the contract situation with Tom's bank, and decided Keith was expendable. Tom said it like he was reporting stock prices, flat and factual. The firm couldn't afford to lose millions in banking contracts over one employee, especially after Tom had mentioned the fraud attempts, and suggested they might want to review Keith's work for other irregularities. I wrapped both hands around my tea mug, feeling the heat seep into my palms. Linda sat down across from me, her face tight with something that might have been worry or might have been anger, hard to tell. Tom kept talking, explaining how Keith's firm had already started auditing his client files, how they'd probably find other problems given his debt situation. My tea was too hot to drink, but I tried anyway, burning my tongue. The sharp pain felt almost good, something physical to focus on instead of the image of Keith getting called into an office and fired. Tom's phone rang again, and he answered immediately, walking back toward his study. Linda and I sat in silence, listening to his voice fade down the hallway. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, not saying anything because what was there to say? Her eyes looked tired, like maybe she hadn't slept much. I wondered if she'd been up all night thinking about how far Tom was taking this, if she'd tried to talk him out of it. But I also knew Linda would never stop Tom from protecting me, no matter how brutal his methods got. We stayed like that for a while, holding hands across the kitchen table, the morning sun coming through the window making everything look too normal and bright for what was happening. 2 days later, I was scrolling through Facebook when Ava's post popped up in my feed. She'd written this long, angry rant about unfair dismissal and corrupt practice owners, claiming she'd been fired for no reason after years of loyal service. My finger hovered over the screen, reading every word twice. She had no idea Tom had orchestrated the whole thing through his golf contact. The practice owner had apparently called her into his office yesterday afternoon and terminated her immediately. Something about concerns over professional conduct and patient privacy. Ava was raging about how she'd never done anything wrong, how this was discrimination, how she was going to sue. The post already had 30 comments from her friends saying how terrible this was, how unfair, offering sympathy and outrage. I felt this weird mix of vindication and guilt churning in my stomach. Part of me wanted to comment and tell everyone what she'd really done, how she'd tried to steal from me, how she'd impersonated my mother to access my trust fund, but another part of me just felt sick watching her lose everything. Linda had warned me to stay off social media completely, said anything I posted could make things worse. I closed the app and put my phone face down on my bed. The guilt sat heavy in my chest even though I knew Ava had brought this on herself. She'd researched my trust fund, practiced impersonating Linda, coordinated with her whole family to commit fraud. Tom wasn't destroying an innocent person. He was making sure a criminal faced consequences. I picked my phone back up and read Ava's post again, her words getting angrier toward the end, talking about how she had bills to pay and kids to support. The comments kept coming, people she knew offering to help her find new work, saying the medical practice would regret this. Nobody knew the real story. Nobody knew she'd tried to steal 30,000 pounds from her biological daughter. I thought about Keith losing his job the same week, about how their whole family was probably panicking right now. Bills piling up with no income coming in. The vindication felt stronger than the guilt this time. They'd planned this together, all 5 of them sitting around working out how to steal from me. Now they were dealing with what happened when you targeted the daughter of someone with Tom's connections and determination. Daniel came home that weekend, showing up Friday evening with a backpack, and this serious expression I'd only seen a few times before. He hugged me in the hallway, holding on longer than usual, then pulled back to look at my face like he was checking if I was okay. Linda made dinner while Daniel and I sat in the living room, and he asked me to tell him everything from the beginning. I went through the whole story again. The phone calls to Mr. Whitmore, the impersonation attempts, Tom hiring the investigator, all of it. Daniel's face got harder as I talked, his jaw clenching when I described how they'd researched my trust fund value and practiced their fake voices. When I finished, he was quiet for a minute, then said he wanted to kill them. The words came out flat and serious, not like a joke or exaggeration. I'd never heard Daniel talk like that about anyone. He said he'd always thought the biological family was weird about money, the way they asked questions and made comments. But he'd figured I should make my own choices about relationships. Now he wished he'd said something sooner, warned me they were obviously just interested in what they could get from our family. Tom called us for dinner, and Daniel spent the meal asking questions about the job terminations, the police report, what was happening next. Tom explained his plans with the same cold precision he'd used with me, and Daniel just nodded along, completely supporting every brutal step. Having my brother's anger on my side made the whole thing feel less wrong somehow. We'd always protected each other growing up, stood up for each other at the school, backed each other up with our parents. This was just an extension of that, Daniel supporting me against people who'd tried to hurt me. After dinner, he suggested we watch a movie, something mindless and funny to take my mind off everything. We ended up on the sofa with Linda between us, some comedy playing that I barely paid attention to. But having Daniel home made the house feel safer, like our family was circling around me to keep the biological family's chaos from getting through. He stayed the whole weekend, barely leaving my side, and I realized how lucky I was to have a brother who dropped everything to come home and make sure I was okay. The twins lost their restaurant jobs on Monday. Both of them terminated the same day. I found out because Jason called my phone that afternoon, his number lighting up my screen while I was doing homework. I didn't answer, just watched it ring until voicemail picked up. 2 minutes later, the notification appeared, and I sat there staring at it, not sure if I wanted to listen. Finally, I pressed play, and Jason's voice came through, high-pitched and panicked in a way I'd never heard from him before. He was yelling about how their lives were being ruined, how they'd both been fired for theft they didn't commit, how someone had obviously set them up. His words tumbled over each other, barely coherent. Something about the owner reviewing security footage and finding discrepancies in the till counts. He said they knew it was Tom, knew our family was behind this, and they were going to prove it somehow. The voicemail cut off mid-sentence, like he'd run out of time or just given up. I played it again, listening to the genuine panic in his voice, the fear underneath the anger. Jason had always been the cocky one, the twin who thought he was smarter than everyone else, and now he sounded desperate. The reality of Tom's revenge hit different hearing that voicemail, making it real in a way the job terminations hadn't felt before. These were actual people losing their income, facing bills they couldn't pay, watching their lives fall apart. I thought about Jason and Riley sitting in some manager's office getting accused of theft, probably knowing exactly who'd caused this but unable to prove anything. The restaurant chain owner was Tom's colleague, had probably been happy to review footage more carefully when Tom suggested there might be problems. Maybe they really had been skimming from the till, or maybe the owner just found enough small discrepancies to justify firing them. Either way, they were gone. 2 more people in that family suddenly unemployed. I saved the voicemail even though Linda had told me not to engage with them at all. Something about having Jason's panic recorded felt important, like evidence that Tom's plan was working exactly how he'd intended. My phone stayed quiet the rest of the day. No more calls from the twins or anyone else in that family. They were probably too busy dealing with their crisis to keep trying to contact me. I wondered if they'd figured out yet that this was just the beginning, that Tom wasn't going to stop until every single one of them had lost everything. Tom showed me the documentation that evening, spreading papers across the dining room table after dinner. Antonia Wilkinson had put together this whole file on the biological family's planning, evidence she'd collected over the past 2 weeks. I sat down and started reading, my stomach dropping further with each page. They'd been researching trust fund access procedures for at least 6 months, way before their first phone call to Mr. Whitmore. Antonia had found their search histories, websites they'd visited about inheritance law and financial fraud, forums where they'd asked questions about security protocols. They'd practiced their impersonations too, evidence of voice recording apps on their phones, notes about Linda's maiden name and Tom's middle name. Ava had written down details about my childhood, things I'd told her during our visits, organizing the information like she was studying for an exam. The fake email addresses had been created weeks before they used them, sitting dormant while they planned out their approach. Every single step had been calculated, discussed, coordinated between all 5 of them. Tom pointed to one page showing Keith's research into Tom's financial disclosures, how he'd found public records showing the approximate value of my trust fund. They'd known exactly what they were going after, down to the specific amount. Another page showed forum posts from Ava asking about ways to bypass identity verification, whether security questions could be answered through research or social engineering. Someone had responded with detailed advice about building relationships with targets first, gathering information slowly so it didn't seem suspicious. My hands started shaking holding the papers. This wasn't desperate people making a stupid mistake. This was a calculated long-term scheme where I'd been the target from the very beginning. Tom had highlighted certain sections, making sure I saw the worst parts. Riley had posted in a gambling forum about coming into money soon, telling people he'd have his debts paid off by summer. Jason had searched for luxury items online, apparently already planning how to spend money they hadn't stolen yet. Even Chloe had been involved in the planning, her phone showing searches about trust fund inheritance and whether adopted children had the same legal rights as biological ones. I pushed the papers away and put my head in my hands. Tom sat down beside me and said this was why he had to destroy them, because they'd spent half a year planning to steal from me. Every visit, every conversation, every time they'd acted interested in my life, had been part of gathering information for their fraud attempt. I'd thought I was building a relationship with my biological family, and they'd been researching how to rob me. I couldn't sleep that night, kept thinking about all those forum posts and search histories. The next morning, I asked Tom if I could see more of what Antonia had found, and he pulled up her full report on his laptop. That's when I discovered they'd joined online forums specifically about trust funds and inheritance fraud. Not general financial forums, but places where people discussed ways to access money they weren't entitled to. Ava had made posts asking about security protocols at solicitor firms, whether phone calls were recorded, how identity verification typically worked. Keith had asked questions about impersonating bank executives, whether voice matching technology was commonly used, what information someone would need to convincingly pretend to be a financial professional. The level of premeditation was staggering. They hadn't just decided one day to try stealing my money. They'd researched methods, asked for advice from other criminals, practiced their approach. One forum post from Ava talked about building long-term relationships with adopted children from wealthy families, suggested that years of contact made the eventual ask for money seem more natural. Another user had responded saying that trust funds were harder to access than regular inheritance, but that impersonation combined with social engineering could work if you had enough personal information. They'd taken that advice and run with it, spending 4 years gathering details about my life, my adoptive family, my childhood memories, every question they'd asked about where I grew up, what Tom did for work, where Daniel went to the school. All of it had been intelligence gathering for their fraud scheme. I found posts from Jason and Riley, too, discussing their gambling debts and how they needed a big score to get clear. They'd talked about their sister being adopted into a rich family, how she had a trust fund worth hundreds of thousands, how their mom was working on getting access to it. This was from 2 years ago, proof they'd been planning this for way longer than 6 months. I sat there reading through pages of forum discussions, watching my biological family plot to steal from me in real time, and something inside me just broke. These people had never wanted a relationship with me. I was never their daughter or sister, just a long-term financial target they'd been carefully cultivating. Every hug, every family dinner, every time Ava had said she loved me, it had all been fake. A performance designed to gather information and build trust they could exploit. Tom found me crying over his laptop and closed it gently, pulling me into a hug. He said he was sorry I had to see all that, but he'd wanted me to understand exactly what they were. Not family, not even decent people who made a bad choice, just criminals who targeted me from the start. The guilt I'd been feeling about their job losses evaporated, replaced by this cold anger that felt almost as scary as Tom's. They'd wasted 4 years of my life, made me believe I had biological family who cared about me, all while planning to steal my future. I pulled away from Tom and asked what else he had planned for them. He smiled, not his normal dad smile, but something harder, and said we were just getting started. Chloe's university expulsion happened next, some letter arriving at their house in Manchester about discrepancies in her application. Ava posted about it on Facebook the same day, this desperate plea about how her daughter's future was destroyed over a misunderstanding. The post was long and rambling, talking about how Chloe was just a kid who'd made mistakes, how the shoplifting incidents were minor and she'd learned her lesson, how the university was being cruel expelling her before she'd even started. Ava's friends commented with sympathy, saying how unfair this was, how universities should be more forgiving. I read through all of it sitting on my bed, my finger hovering over the comment box. Part of me wanted to write that stealing from family wasn't a misunderstanding, that Chloe had actively participated in trying to commit fraud against me, that maybe she should face consequences for her actions. But Linda's advice echoed in my head: stay completely off social media during this situation. Engaging with Ava's posts would only make things messier, give them ammunition to claim I was harassing them or something. I closed Facebook and opened Instagram instead, but Ava had posted there too. Same desperate message about Chloe's destroyed future. The comments were full of people offering support, saying they'd write letters to the university, suggesting Ava contact the media about unfair treatment. Nobody knew that Chloe had shown up at Whitmore and Associates pretending to be me, that she'd been part of a coordinated fraud scheme, that her shoplifting record was way more extensive than 3 incidents. Tom had made sure the university found out everything, and now Chloe was facing real consequences for the first time in her life. I thought about her sitting in that house in Manchester, probably crying about losing her university place, maybe finally understanding that actions had results. She was only 14, younger than me when I'd first met the biological family, and part of me felt bad for her. But then I remembered her glaring at me during family dinners, like I'd stolen something that should have been hers. Remembered her excited participation in the fraud scheme according to Antonia's evidence. Chloe had known what she was doing, had chosen to be part of it, and now she was learning that choices mattered. Linda knocked on my door and came in without waiting for an answer, sitting down beside me on the bed. She could probably tell I'd been reading Ava's posts, could see it on my face. She took my phone gently and set it on the nightstand, then pulled me into a hug. Her arms felt safe and steady, nothing like the biological family's fake affection. She said Ava would keep posting desperate messages, keep trying to paint herself as the victim, but I needed to stay out of it completely. Anything I said publicly would get twisted, used against us, turned into evidence that we were the bad guys somehow. The best thing I could do was let Tom handle everything and focus on taking care of myself. I nodded against her shoulder, knowing she was right, but hating how helpless it made me feel. The next morning, Mr. Whitmore called Tom's mobile while we were having breakfast. I could hear the urgency in Tom's voice as he answered, could see his expression shift from casual to focused in seconds. He put the phone on speaker so Linda and I could hear. Mr. Whitmore explained that he'd formally reported the fraud attempts to the police. A detective named Kurt Wilkinson had been assigned to the case and wanted to interview me about my relationship with the biological family. He needed to understand the history, the suspicious behavior, the gradual escalation of their interest in money. Tom asked when and where, his hand already reaching for his diary. Mr. Whitmore said Kurt could meet me at a police station in London whenever was convenient. Probably needed a few hours for a thorough statement. I felt my stomach twist at the thought of recounting everything, of laying out 4 years of relationship building only to realize it had all been fake. Linda squeezed my hand across the table and said she'd come with me. Tom nodded and told Mr. Whitmore to arrange it for the next day. Give me time to prepare mentally. The police station in London was nothing like I'd imagined, just a regular office building with interview rooms that looked like conference spaces. Kurt Wilkinson was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with a kind face that made talking easier. He set up a recording device and explained that everything I said would be documented as evidence. I started from the beginning, from when Ava and Keith first reached out through social services. Kurt asked specific questions about their initial approach, whether they'd mentioned money right away. I explained they'd been subtle at first, just asking general questions about Tom's job and where we lived. But over the years, the questions got more direct, more pointed. Ava would ask about trust funds during casual conversations, wondering if Tom had set anything up for us kids. Keith would joke about me sharing the wealth with my real family, laughing like it was funny when it clearly wasn't. The twins constantly hinted about needing help with university costs, never directly asking but making their financial struggles very obvious. I talked for nearly 2 hours and Kurt kept recording, kept taking notes, kept asking follow-up questions. He wanted specifics about every conversation I could remember, every hint they'd dropped, every time they'd pushed boundaries around money. By the end, I felt exhausted and sick, realizing how many red flags I'd ignored because I wanted them to be real family. Kurt turned off the recorder and looked at me seriously. He said the evidence of coordination was overwhelming, that this wasn't just attempted fraud, but a serious criminal conspiracy case. Multiple family members working together over years to research, plan, and execute a scheme to steal from me. The premeditation made it much worse legally than if it had been one desperate person making a stupid choice. 3 days later, Tom came home from work, holding a thick envelope with an angry expression. He dropped it on the kitchen table where Linda and I were making dinner. It was a letter from a solicitor representing the biological family, threatening legal action for interfering with their employment. The letter claimed Tom had used his professional influence to get innocent people fired without cause, that his actions constituted harassment and defamation. Linda read it over Tom's shoulder, her face getting redder with each paragraph. The solicitor was demanding Tom cease all contact with their employers and pay compensation for lost wages. Tom pulled out his phone and called his own solicitor right there in the kitchen. He explained the situation in clipped, professional tones, then forwarded photos of the threatening letter. His solicitor called back within an hour with a response already drafted. Tom put it on speaker so we could hear. The response detailed every fraud attempt with dates and times, included Mr. Whitmore's formal complaint to police, and suggested the biological family focus on their impending criminal charges, instead of making baseless threats. The letter ended by stating that any further harassment would be reported to Kurt Wilkinson as witness intimidation. Tom looked satisfied as he authorized his solicitor to send it immediately. 2 days after that, Helen called Tom's office during business hours. His secretary transferred the call to his mobile because he'd left instructions about any contact from Manchester numbers. Tom answered and immediately started recording, a habit he'd developed since this whole situation began. Helen's voice was shaky and apologetic, saying she needed to explain her role in the hospital administrator impersonation. She claimed Ava had pressured her into it, had told her I was actually sick and needed help getting money released from my trust fund. Tom let her talk, didn't interrupt, just let her dig herself deeper. Helen admitted she'd known it was fraud, that Ava had coached her on what to say, but she'd done it anyway because Ava was her sister and they were desperate. She started crying and begging Tom to show mercy, saying she had kids of her own and couldn't afford criminal charges. Tom thanked her for calling and hung up without making any promises. Then he forwarded the entire recording to Kurt Wilkinson with a brief email explaining Helen's admission of knowing participation. I watched him do it and felt cold, realizing how methodically Tom was building the case against every single person who'd tried to steal from me. That night, I had the first nightmare. I was in our house in Surrey alone when I heard knocking at the door. I looked through the window and saw the whole biological family standing there. Ava and Keith and the twins and even Chloe. They were smiling, but their eyes were wrong, cold and calculating. I tried to run, but the house had too many doors and they kept appearing at different entrances, getting closer each time. I woke up sweating and shaking, Linda rushing into my room because I'd apparently been crying in my sleep. She sat on my bed and held me while I explained the nightmare. How terrified I'd felt, even though logically I knew they were in Manchester dealing with their own crisis. Linda stroked my hair and said maybe I should talk to someone professional about processing the betrayal. She'd been worried about me. Could see how the situation was affecting me even though I tried to act normal. The biological family's destruction felt deserved, but also horrifying, and I didn't know how to reconcile those feelings. Linda said she'd find me a good therapist, someone who specialized in adoption issues and family trauma. The first therapy session happened the following week in a quiet office near our house. Dr. Marley Simmons was an older woman with gray hair and a gentle manner that made me feel less defensive. She asked me to explain why I was there, and I stumbled through the story feeling stupid and confused. I told her my adoptive father was systematically ruining my biological family's lives, and I felt both grateful and horrified. Dr. Simmons listened without judgment, just nodding and taking occasional notes. When I finished, she asked how those two feelings showed up in my body, where I felt the gratitude and where I felt the horror. I'd never thought about it that way before, but I realized the gratitude sat in my chest, warm and solid, while the horror twisted in my stomach, cold and sick. She explained that both feelings could exist at the same time without making me a bad person. Humans were complicated and trauma responses were complicated, and I didn't have to choose one emotion over the other. I could be grateful Tom was protecting me while also being horrified by the extent of his revenge. Both things were true, and both things were okay. Something about hearing her say that made me cry harder than I'd cried since this whole situation started. Daniel came home from university that weekend specifically to check on me. We sat in his room like we used to when we were kids, just talking about everything. He admitted he'd never trusted the biological family from the first time we met them. He said they looked at me like I was a bank account, not a sister, and it had made him uncomfortable from day one. I asked why he never warned me, and he looked guilty. He explained that he'd wanted to say something but didn't want to seem jealous or controlling, didn't want to be the adoptive brother trying to interfere with my biological family connection. Tom and Linda had told him to let me make my own choices and form my own opinions. So he'd stayed quiet and watched them circle closer, watched them ask increasingly inappropriate questions about money, watched them treat me like an investment they were cultivating. Hearing him say all this made me realize how carefully my adoptive family had tried to support my choices, while privately worrying about me. They'd given me space to build relationships with the biological family, even though they saw the red flags clearly. They'd trusted me to figure it out on my own, and when I couldn't, when the biological family escalated to actual fraud, Tom had stepped in with overwhelming force. Tom came home from work one evening a few weeks later with that cold, focused expression I'd learned to recognize. He sat us all down in the living room and announced he wasn't finished yet. The job losses were just the beginning, he said. He'd been digging into the biological family's financial records through his banking contacts and found evidence of other fraudulent activities beyond the trust fund attempts. Linda looked worried, asking if he was taking this too far, but Tom shook his head. He said these people had targeted our daughter, had researched and planned and coordinated to steal from her, and they needed to face every consequence of their actions. He'd found things, he said. Things that showed the fraud attempts against me were just one scheme in a pattern of criminal behavior. Daniel asked what kind of things, and Tom said he'd let his investigator explain the details. Antonia Wilkinson was coming over the next day to present her findings about Keith and Ava's other activities. Antonia arrived the next afternoon with a thick folder of documents and a grim expression. She spread papers across our dining room table while Tom, Linda, Daniel, and I gathered around. She explained that Keith had been embezzling small amounts from his accounting firm's clients for years. Nothing huge but consistent. £5 here, £10 there, always small enough that individual clients wouldn't notice but adding up to thousands over time. This explained part of their £40,000 debt, she said. Keith had been stealing to cover other debts and bad investments, creating a cycle of fraud to cover fraud. Antonia had documented everything with bank records and transaction histories. Tom asked if she had enough evidence for the authorities, and she nodded. She'd prepared a complete report with all supporting documentation. Tom told her to send it anonymously to the accounting firm's senior partners and the financial regulatory authorities. He wanted Keith to face professional and criminal consequences for every fraudulent thing he'd done, not just the trust fund attempts. The next revelation was about Ava. Antonia explained that Ava had been stealing medications from the medical practice where she worked as a receptionist. Nothing major like controlled substances, but over-the-counter medications, sample packs that drug representatives left, things she could resell or use herself. The practice had noticed inventory discrepancies, but hadn't investigated thoroughly until Antonia's tip. She'd found evidence of Ava taking medications over a 2-year period, documented through security footage and inventory records. Tom asked how she'd gotten access to that information, and Antonia just smiled slightly and said she had contacts everywhere. Tom told her to make sure the practice owner found out everything, that he wanted Ava facing additional criminal charges beyond her dismissal. He wanted theft charges and professional misconduct charges that would follow her forever. Linda put her hand on Tom's arm and asked if this was really necessary, if destroying them this completely was the right thing to do. Tom looked at her with an expression I'd never seen before, something fierce and protective and slightly scary. He said they'd targeted his daughter, his child, and they would pay for every crime they'd ever committed. He wasn't stopping until they were completely destroyed. 2 days later, Tom got a call from his colleague who owned the restaurant chain where the twins worked. The owner had taken Tom's suggestion seriously and started checking the security footage and transaction records more carefully. What they found went way beyond the till discrepancies that got Jason and Riley fired. The twins had been running a betting scam for at least 8 months. They'd been taking photos of customer credit cards when processing payments, writing down the numbers and security codes. Then they'd use those card details to place sports bets through online gambling sites. Small amounts, usually 20 or 30 pounds at a time, spread across dozens of different cards, so individual customers wouldn't notice right away. The restaurant owner found records of over 200 fraudulent transactions totaling nearly 15,000 pounds. Tom sat at the kitchen table going through the documentation the owner had sent over, his face getting darker with every page. The twins hadn't just stolen from their employer, they'd been stealing from regular people who came in for dinner. Families, elderly couples, students, anyone who paid by card was a potential target. The owner was filing a police report and pursuing criminal charges. He was also contacting every customer whose card information had been compromised, which meant hundreds of people would find out they'd been victims of fraud. I felt sick reading through it all. This wasn't just about my trust fund anymore. Ava and Keith trying to steal from me was personal and horrible, but at least it was targeted. The twins had been running an operation that hurt countless strangers who'd done nothing except eat at a restaurant, thinking about some elderly person checking their bank statement and seeing charges they didn't recognize. The confusion and fear that would cause. These weren't desperate people making one bad choice in a crisis. These were criminals who'd been systematically stealing for months, maybe longer. Tom pointed out that the betting scam probably started before the trust fund attempts, which meant the fraud against me was just another scheme in a pattern of criminal behavior. They saw opportunities to steal and they took them, over and over. I asked Tom if he thought they'd always been like this, or if the debt had pushed them into it. He said it didn't matter, that plenty of people dealt with debt without becoming thieves. The biological family had made choices, and those choices showed who they really were. Antonia called the next morning with more information about Chloe. The 3 shoplifting incidents we knew about were just what she'd been caught for. Antonia had been digging deeper into Chloe's social media and friend groups, and she'd found evidence of something much bigger. Chloe was part of an organized retail theft ring operating across Manchester. Groups of teenagers would go into shops together, distracting staff while others filled bags with merchandise. They'd hit multiple stores in one afternoon, then sell everything online through fake accounts. Antonia had screenshots of Chloe bragging about it in private group chats, photos of stolen clothes and electronics, conversations about which shops had the weakest security. The operation had been running for over a year. Chloe wasn't some kid who stole a lipstick on impulse. She was actively participating in organized crime. The police in Manchester were already investigating the theft ring after several retailers reported coordinated hits. Antonia had anonymously forwarded all her evidence to the detective handling the case. Tom asked if Chloe would face serious charges given her age, and Antonia said probably. Organized retail theft was treated more seriously than individual shoplifting, especially when there was clear evidence of planning and coordination. The university expulsion was nothing compared to what Chloe might be facing with criminal charges. I sat in my room that afternoon trying to process everything. My biological family weren't just people who'd made one desperate attempt to steal my trust fund. They were criminals. Keith embezzling from clients, Ava stealing medications, the twins running credit card fraud, Chloe in a theft ring. Every single one of them had been breaking the law for months or years. I kept asking myself if they'd always been like this, or if something had broken in them. Maybe the debt crisis had pushed them over some line. Maybe they'd started with small things and it escalated. But Tom's words kept coming back to me. Plenty of people struggled with money without becoming thieves. Plenty of families faced hardship without coordinating fraud schemes against their own relatives. At some point, the biological family had looked at their situation and decided that stealing was acceptable. They'd made that choice over and over, from strangers and from me. I wanted to believe they were just desperate, that circumstances had forced them into bad decisions. That would be easier to understand. But the evidence showed planning and repetition. These weren't panicked mistakes. They were deliberate actions. The house phone rang that evening while Tom was still at work. Linda answered in the kitchen, and I heard her voice change immediately. She grabbed a pen and started writing notes, her face tight. She kept saying things like yes, and I understand, and that's very interesting. When she hung up, she told me it had been Ava calling. Linda had recognized the number from when Ava used to call me, so she'd recorded the whole conversation on her phone. Ava and Keith were begging Linda to make Tom stop destroying their lives. They'd lost their jobs, they had legal fees piling up, the twins were facing criminal charges, and Chloe might end up with a record. Ava kept saying they were desperate and they'd made mistakes, but they were still family. She said I should understand that family helps family in crisis, that blood meant something. Keith got on the phone at one point and admitted they'd tried to access the trust fund, but he claimed they'd only done it because they were drowning in debt and didn't know what else to do. He said they'd never actually meant to hurt me. They just needed help and didn't know how to ask. Linda had stayed calm through the whole call, just letting them talk and recording everything. She told them she'd discuss it with Tom and hung up. Linda played the recording for me after dinner. Hearing Ava's voice made my stomach hurt. She sounded scared and tired, which part of me felt bad about. But then she started talking about family helping family, and I felt rage replace the guilt. They'd researched my trust fund for months. They'd practiced impersonations. They'd coordinated multiple fraud attempts using different tactics. That wasn't asking for help. That was stealing. Keith's admission that they'd tried to access the fund but claiming they meant no harm was insulting. How do you steal 30,000 pounds from someone without meaning to hurt them? The money was mine, saved for me by parents who actually loved me, and they'd tried to take it through lies and fraud. Now they wanted sympathy because they were facing consequences. Ava kept saying I should understand family helping family, like stealing from me was some kind of family obligation. That's not how family works. Real family doesn't research your finances and plan elaborate schemes to rob you. Real family doesn't see you as a bank account with a blood connection. Tom and Linda had given me everything, raised me, protected me, and never once made me feel like I owed them anything. The biological family had given me nothing except years of uncomfortable questions about money, and now they thought I should feel guilty for not letting them steal from me. Kurt called Tom's mobile the next evening with an update. The Crown Prosecution Service had reviewed all the evidence and decided to move forward with fraud charges against all 5 biological family members. Ava and Keith were being charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted fraud. Jason and Riley were facing the same charges plus the credit card fraud from the restaurant. Chloe was charged despite being only 14 because of her active participation in the impersonation attempt at Whitmore's office. Kurt explained that showing up in person and actively trying to deceive the staff made her culpable under the law. Her age would be considered in sentencing but wouldn't prevent prosecution. The organized retail theft charges were separate and being handled by different officers in Manchester, but those would likely move forward too. Kurt said the evidence was overwhelming. They had recordings of the phone calls, the fake emails, security footage of Chloe at the solicitor's office, and testimony from Mr. Whitmore and his staff. The biological family's admissions to Linda about attempting the fraud made it even stronger. Their solicitor would probably advise them to plead guilty and hope for leniency. Tom played Jason's voicemail for us after Kurt's call. Jason sounded panicked and desperate. He said he knew Tom was behind everything falling apart for them. He said he'd testify against his parents if Tom would help him avoid prosecution. He'd tell the police everything about how Ava and Keith planned the whole thing, how they'd pressured him and Riley into helping. He said he'd made mistakes, but he was young and his parents had manipulated him. He kept saying please over and over, his voice breaking. Tom listened to the whole message with no expression, then forwarded it to Kurt without responding. Linda asked if he was really going to ignore a plea for help from a 20-year-old, and Tom said Jason wasn't asking for help. He was trying to trade his parents for his own freedom. He said the police could handle the biological family's attempts to turn on each other. He wasn't getting involved in their desperate bargaining. Daniel said Jason deserved whatever happened to him for participating in credit card fraud for months. You don't accidentally steal from hundreds of people. You make that choice every single day. Riley showed up at Tom's bank 3 days later. I don't know how he found out where Tom worked exactly. Maybe from all their research into his career, or maybe from asking around in banking circles. He made it into the lobby somehow before security noticed him. He was yelling about Tom ruining their lives, demanding to talk to him, saying Tom had no right to destroy their family over a misunderstanding. Security called Tom's office to verify, then escorted Riley out of the building. Tom got a restraining order that same afternoon, filing paperwork that prohibited Riley from coming within 500 feet of him, our house, his workplace, or any of us. The solicitor handling it said Riley's appearance at the bank showed escalating behavior that could become dangerous. People who felt cornered sometimes did unpredictable things. Tom came home that evening looking shaken in a way I'd never seen before. He'd always been so controlled and confident, but Riley showing up at his workplace had rattled him. He told Linda we needed to take security seriously now. The biological family was losing everything and they blamed us. Desperate people were dangerous people. Linda called a security company the next morning. They came out that afternoon to assess our house in Surrey and recommend upgrades. We ended up getting a complete system overhaul. New locks on all the doors and windows. Motion sensor lights around the entire property. Security cameras covering every entrance and the driveway. A monitored alarm system that would alert the police if triggered. The technicians spent 2 days installing everything, and I hated every minute of it. I hated that I was scared of my biological family. I hated that we needed cameras and alarms because people who shared my DNA might show up and do something violent. Ava and Keith had seemed pathetic and desperate on that call to Linda, but Riley screaming in Tom's bank lobby showed a different side. They were angry now, not just scared. They blamed Tom for their consequences instead of accepting responsibility for their crimes. The restraining order would stop Riley legally, but it wouldn't stop him physically if he decided he had nothing left to lose. The security system made our house feel like a fortress, which was good for safety, but terrible for feeling like this was home. Daniel called from university that weekend and said he was coming home for a week. Tom told him it wasn't necessary, that we were fine with the new security system, but Daniel insisted. He said he couldn't focus on classes knowing Linda and I were alone in the house during the day while Tom was at work. What if Riley showed up again? Or one of the others? What if they decided to try something desperate? Daniel said he'd already talked to his professors about taking the week remote and doing his coursework from home. He arrived Sunday evening with his laptop and a bag of clothes. He set himself up in the living room where he could see the driveway through the window, and he barely left that spot all week except to sleep. He'd work on his assignments but kept glancing up at the security camera feeds on his phone. Linda tried to tell him he was being overprotective, but I was grateful he was there. Having Daniel home made me feel safer in a way the cameras and alarms couldn't. He was my brother, my real brother, the one who'd grown up with me and protected me my whole life. The biological family had given me nothing except fear and betrayal. My adoptive family had given me everything, including a brother who'd drop his university week to make sure I was safe. My next therapy session with Marley happened 2 days after Daniel went back to university. I sat in her office and told her everything Tom had done to the biological family, listing each job loss and consequence like reading off a shopping list. She listened without interrupting, then asked how I felt about it all. I said I felt guilty, like their lives falling apart was somehow my fault, even though I knew logically I hadn't done anything wrong. Marley leaned forward and said I needed to separate my existence from their actions. I didn't commit fraud, she reminded me. I didn't impersonate anyone or lie to solicitors or create fake emails. The biological family made those choices themselves, and Tom's response, however extreme it seemed, was addressing their criminal behavior, not punishing them for being related to me. She said I wasn't responsible for their consequences any more than I was responsible for their debts, or their decision to target me in the first place. The guilt I felt was normal, she explained, because I'm a person with empathy who doesn't like seeing others suffer even when they've hurt me. But carrying that guilt wasn't fair to myself, and it definitely wasn't what Tom and Linda would want for me. We spent the rest of the session talking about boundaries and how the biological family had violated every single one from the moment they made contact 4 years ago. 3 days later, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw Ava had posted a long rant on her public profile. She wrote about how adoption ruins families and tears children away from their real relatives. She claimed adoptive parents brainwash kids into hating their biological families and thinking they're better than where they came from. The post went on for paragraphs about how wealthy people use adoption to steal children and turn them into spoiled brats who forget their roots. She never mentioned me by name, but anyone who knew about our situation would recognize exactly what she was talking about. I screenshot the entire post immediately, saving every word before she could delete it. Then I called Tom's solicitor and sent him the screenshots. He reviewed them within an hour and called back to say this could be used as evidence of harassment if Ava continued trying to contact us. He said the post showed a pattern of behavior that might violate the conditions the police had set when they'd opened the fraud investigation. I checked Facebook again that evening and the post was gone, but I had the proof saved on my phone and my laptop. A week later, Tom's solicitor contacted us again with news that the biological family's debt situation was getting worse. The criminal legal fees were piling up as they each hired their own solicitors to defend against the fraud charges. They'd started a crowdfunding campaign on 2 different platforms, claiming they were victims of a wealthy family's vendetta. The campaigns described Tom as a vindictive banker who was using his connections to destroy a struggling working-class family for no reason. They painted themselves as innocent people caught up in a misunderstanding about trust fund procedures, not criminals who'd coordinated multiple fraud attempts. Tom's solicitor immediately sent cease and desist letters to both crowdfunding platforms, pointing out that the campaigns were based on fraudulent claims and asking for money under false pretenses. Within 48 hours, both campaigns were removed, and the small amounts they'd raised were refunded to donors. The platforms sent messages to the biological family warning them that creating new campaigns with similar claims would result in permanent bans and possible legal action. I found out through mutual contacts on social media that the biological family was telling everyone a completely different version of events. According to their story, I was a spoiled rich girl who'd refused to help my struggling real family when they asked for support. They claimed they'd only contacted the solicitor to inquire about proper procedures for family financial assistance, and Tom had overreacted and destroyed their lives out of spite. People who didn't know the full situation were apparently sympathizing with them, sharing their posts about how adoption creates inequality and divides families. I wanted to post my own version of events, to publicly explain that they'd tried to steal from me through fraud and impersonation. I drafted a Facebook post 3 different times, each version angrier than the last. But before I could hit publish, Linda sat down next to me and asked to see what I'd written. She read it quietly, then told me that silence was stronger than engaging with their lies. She explained that responding would just create drama and give them attention they didn't deserve. The people who mattered already knew the truth, and anyone who believed the biological family's version without asking questions wasn't worth convincing. I deleted all 3 drafts and blocked every mutual contact I had with them on social media. Kurt called me 2 weeks after our first interview and asked if I could come back to the police station for a more detailed conversation. He said the Crown Prosecution Service needed a complete timeline of my relationship with the biological family to prove the fraud attempts were part of a long-term scheme rather than a desperate mistake. I met him at the same station in London, and this time the interview lasted almost 4 hours. Kurt asked about every single interaction I could remember from the past 4 years. When did Ava first mention money? What exactly did Keith say about sharing wealth with real family? How many times did the twins hint about needing help with university costs? When did I notice Chloe's attitude toward me? I walked through years of conversations and visits, describing how their questions about Tom's job and our house had escalated over time. Kurt recorded everything and took pages of notes, organizing the timeline on a big whiteboard in the interview room. By the end, we could see the clear pattern of their increasing financial questions and boundary-pushing requests. What had seemed like random comments at the time now looked like systematic information gathering. Kurt said the timeline made the long-term nature of their scheme crystal clear, and it would be powerful evidence when the case went to court. That evening, Tom called me into his study and showed me a folder of documents his investigator had found. The biological family had researched UK inheritance laws and trust fund regulations for months before their fraud attempts. They'd visited legal advice websites and downloaded guides about challenging trust fund legitimacy. They'd even consulted with a dodgy solicitor in Manchester about ways to contest my trust fund, asking whether biological parents had any legal claim to money set aside for adopted children. The solicitor had apparently told them they had no legal standing, which was probably why they'd resorted to fraud instead. The documents showed they'd explored every possible legal angle to get my money before deciding to impersonate me and my adoptive parents. Tom's investigator had found browser history, saved PDFs, and even handwritten notes about different strategies they'd considered. Looking through the evidence made me feel sick, because it proved they'd spent months planning how to steal from me while pretending to build a relationship. The next piece of evidence Tom showed me was even worse. The investigator had recovered deleted messages from the twins' phones showing they'd discussed fabricating a medical emergency for Chloe. They'd planned to tell me she needed urgent surgery that the NHS wouldn't cover, then present me with fake hospital bills they'd created using Photoshop. The messages included drafts of the Photoshop files and discussions about how much money to ask for. They'd debated whether $20,000 or $30,000 would be more believable for emergency medical costs. Riley had written that they should make it about Chloe because I might feel more sympathetic toward the youngest sister than toward him or Jason. The manipulation planning was so detailed and calculated that I had to leave Tom's study and go to my room. I sat on my bed feeling physically ill, realizing how close they'd come to using a fake medical crisis to steal from me. If the trust fund fraud attempts hadn't happened first, I might have fallen for the medical emergency story and voluntarily given them money. Daniel came home from university that weekend and went straight to the family computer in the living room. He'd been thinking about something and wanted to check the old email account we'd all shared years ago before he and I got our own accounts. He spent an hour scrolling through archived messages, then called Tom, Linda, and me over to look at what he'd found. The biological family had been asking Tom and Linda for money since I'd first made contact at 17. There were emails from Ava asking if they could help with the twins' university fees. Messages from Keith requesting loans for his business ventures. Even one from Chloe asking if Linda could buy her a laptop for school. Tom and Linda had quietly refused every single request, always politely but firmly, explaining that they couldn't provide financial support to my biological family. They'd never told me about any of these requests, trying to let me form my own relationship with the biological family without prejudice. Daniel showed me timestamps proving the requests had started within weeks of my first meeting with them and had continued regularly for 4 years. Tom and Linda had been protecting me from knowing that the biological family saw them as a source of money from the very beginning. I confronted Tom and Linda that night, angry that they hadn't warned me about the biological family's constant money requests. Linda said they'd hoped the requests would stop, and that Ava and Keith might genuinely want to know me as a person, not just as a connection to wealth. Tom admitted they'd made a mistake by not being more direct about the red flags, but they'd been trying to respect my autonomy and let me make my own decisions about the relationship. My next therapy session with Marley helped me understand their choice had come from love, even if I wished they'd handled it differently. Marley pointed out that telling me at 17 that my biological family was asking for money might have made me feel like I had to choose between my two families or prove my loyalty. Tom and Linda had been trying to protect me from that impossible position while hoping the biological family would eventually stop treating them like a bank. I was still frustrated they hadn't warned me, but I understood their intentions had been good, even if the outcome had been painful. The preliminary court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in Manchester Crown Court. Tom, Linda, Daniel, and I all made the drive up from Surrey, meeting Kurt outside the courthouse at 9. All 5 biological family members were there with their solicitors, standing in a cluster near the entrance. Ava looked terrible, her hair unwashed and her clothes wrinkled. Keith wouldn't make eye contact with any of us. The twins kept whispering to each other, and Chloe stood slightly apart from the rest of her family, staring at the ground. We went through security and sat in the public gallery while the preliminary hearing began. The judge reviewed the charges against each family member and asked for their pleas. One by one, all 5 of them pleaded not guilty, despite the overwhelming evidence Kurt had collected. Their solicitor stood up and tried to argue they'd been confused about trust fund access procedures, not attempting fraud. He claimed they'd believed family members could request funds on behalf of the trust beneficiary, and had simply made mistakes with the security questions. Kurt told us afterward that it was a desperate strategy that wouldn't work. The evidence of coordination, the multiple impersonation attempts, the fake emails, and the 4-year timeline of financial obsession made it impossible to claim innocent confusion. The judge set a trial date for 3 months away, and granted the prosecution's request to maintain all existing bail conditions, including the restraining order keeping Riley away from Tom's workplace. 2 days after the court hearing, Tom called me down to his study. Antonia sat across from his desk with her laptop open, her expression grim. She'd been digging deeper into the Bio family's background, and what she'd found made my stomach turn. She pulled up screenshots of Facebook groups and online forums, showing me posts from years ago, where someone using a fake name had been asking detailed questions about trust funds and adoptive families. The profile picture was blurry, but when Antonia zoomed in on one photo where the person's face was partially visible, I recognized her immediately. It was Ava. She'd been active in adoption reunion groups, support forums for biological parents, and even some sketchy financial advice communities. Her questions were always the same pattern, asking about trust fund access, what adoptive parents typically set up for adopted children, how to reconnect with biological children who'd been adopted by wealthy families. Antonia had found at least 7 other adopted people Ava had contacted over the past 5 years, all of them from families with money. She'd sent friend requests, left comments on their posts, asked seemingly innocent questions about their relationships with their adoptive parents. Most of them had ignored her or blocked her after a few messages, but she'd kept trying with different accounts under different names. I felt physically sick looking at the evidence spread across Tom's desk. I wasn't special to her. Wasn't her daughter she'd been desperate to reconnect with. I was just the one who'd actually responded to her initial contact, the one whose adoptive parents had enough money to make years of fake relationship building worth the effort. Tom reached across and squeezed my hand while I stared at the screen. Antonia explained that Ava had been researching this type of scheme for at least 6 years based on the oldest posts she could find. The calculated nature of it destroyed something in me, the last tiny piece of hope I'd been holding on to, that maybe some small part of her approach had been genuine. She'd selected me like someone shopping online, scrolling through options until she found one worth pursuing. Kurt called the next afternoon with an update that made things worse. His team had been investigating the twins' gambling debts, and they'd discovered Riley and Jason owed money to some genuinely dangerous people in Manchester. Not just bookies or casual loan sharks, but organized criminals who had a reputation for violence when debts went unpaid. The twins owed nearly £15,000 combined, and their creditors were getting impatient. Kurt's voice was serious when he told us this made the Bio family unpredictable. Desperate people with violent criminals breathing down their necks might do something stupid, might try to contact me directly or show up at our house. Tom's jaw tightened as he listened to Kurt's warning. That evening, a security consultant showed up at our Surrey house, a former police officer who specialized in residential protection. He walked through every room, checked all the windows and doors, examined our current alarm system, and found it lacking. He recommended motion sensor lights for the entire perimeter, security cameras with night vision covering all entrances, reinforced locks on the doors, and a panic button system connected directly to the local police station. Tom approved everything immediately, telling the consultant to install it all within the week. Linda looked pale as the consultant explained the various threat scenarios, and I realized how much danger we might actually be in. The twins knew where we lived because I'd stupidly invited them to visit once, back when I'd thought we were building a real relationship. They knew our address, had seen the inside of our house, knew which room was mine. The security consultant recommended I vary my daily routine, avoid being alone outside the house, and keep my phone charged at all times. I felt like I was living in a crime drama, except this was my actual life now. The next blow came from Chloe's school. Tom's investigator had sent them documentation about her shoplifting record, the same information that had gotten her university place revoked. The school held an emergency meeting with Ava and Keith, and the outcome was swift. Chloe was expelled not just for the theft record she'd hidden on her enrollment forms, but for her participation in the trust fund fraud attempt. The school had a strict code of conduct, and criminal behavior violated it completely. Ava lost it on Facebook that night, posting a long rant about how her daughter's entire future was destroyed over one mistake. She painted Chloe as a victim, claimed she'd been pressured by her parents, said a 14-year-old shouldn't have her life ruined for following her family's lead. I read the post 3 times, feeling this complicated knot in my chest. Part of me felt genuinely bad for Chloe because she was just a kid whose parents had involved her in crime. Ava and Keith had brought their 14-year-old daughter to a solicitor's office to commit fraud, had coached her on how to impersonate me, had made her an active participant in stealing from me. But another part of me remembered how Chloe had looked at me during family visits, that cold glare like I'd personally stolen her life by being adopted into money. She'd been old enough to know right from wrong, old enough to say no to her parents' scheme. The security footage from Whitmore and Associates showed her walking in confidently, not scared or reluctant. She'd wanted to be part of it. I closed Facebook and tried not to think about whether a 14-year-old deserved to have her education destroyed, but I couldn't quite shake the image of her being escorted out by security while trying to steal my money. A week later, Tom's solicitor received a formal letter from the Bio family's legal representation. They were offering a plea deal where all 5 of them would plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for Tom stopping his professional retaliation campaign. Their solicitor laid out the terms in careful legal language, but the message was clear. They'd admit to attempted fraud if Tom would stop destroying their lives and livelihoods. Tom read the letter twice, then handed it to his own solicitor with instructions to refuse. He told me that evening his response was simple. Their criminal consequences for the fraud attempts were completely separate from the natural professional consequences of being fraudsters. He'd informed his colleagues and contacts about their criminal behavior, and what those people chose to do with that information was their own decision. He wasn't forcing anyone to fire them or refuse to work with them. He was just making sure the truth was known. Being known fraudsters made them unemployable. That was their problem, not his. Linda looked worried when he explained this, asking quietly if maybe enough damage had been done. Tom's response was cold. They'd tried to steal from his daughter, had researched and planned it for months, had involved their own children in crime. He didn't care if they ended up homeless and destitute. They'd earned every consequence coming their way. I sat there listening to him and feeling this weird mix of gratitude and unease. He was protecting me fiercely, but his anger was so intense it scared me sometimes. Mr. Whitmore called and asked me to come to his office to discuss additional security measures for my trust fund. I drove to London with Linda the next morning, and we sat in his familiar office while he explained the new protocols he wanted to implement. All my existing security questions would be changed to things only I could possibly know, specific memories and details that even Tom and Linda weren't fully aware of. He wanted to add biometric verification, fingerprint and retinal scans that would be required for any in-person requests. He was setting up a two-person authorization system, where both he and a senior partner would need to approve any disbursements over £5,000. He apologized repeatedly for not having stronger protocols in place from the beginning, even though I kept telling him he'd handled the fraud attempts perfectly and protected my money completely. He looked genuinely upset, like he felt personally responsible for the Bio family's attempt to steal from me. I thanked him for everything he'd done, for recognizing the fake calls immediately, for contacting Tom and Linda right away, for keeping my trust fund completely secure through their coordinated attack. He walked us through the new security setup, had me create new answers to impossible questions, took my biometric scans for the database. By the time we left his office 2 hours later, my trust fund had better security than most bank vaults. Linda bought me lunch in London afterward, and we talked about how strange it felt that money I couldn't even access for another few months had caused so much destruction. That night, Tom did something I'd never seen before. He sat down with Linda and me in the living room and admitted he felt guilty. His voice was quiet when he said he should have vetted the Bio family more carefully before supporting my relationship with them. He should have hired an investigator years ago, should have looked into their background and finances, should have protected me from people who only wanted to use me. Linda reached over and took his hand, her voice gentle when she reminded him I'd been 17 and had the right to know my biological family. He couldn't have predicted they'd be criminals without evidence, and treating every biological family like potential fraudsters would have been wrong too. She told him he'd made the right choice supporting my decision to connect with them, that respecting my autonomy had been more important than his protective instincts. Tom looked at me with this expression of pain and regret, asking if I blamed him for not stopping me from building a relationship with them. I told him honestly that I didn't blame him at all, that I'd wanted to know them so badly I would have found a way even if he'd tried to stop me. Linda was right. I'd had the right to make my own choices even if those choices led to pain. He'd been the best father I could have asked for, protecting me when it mattered and trusting me to make my own decisions when I needed that freedom. We sat there for a long time, the three of us processing everything that had happened and how it had changed our family. Daniel came home from university that weekend specifically to talk to me. We went for a walk through the neighborhood, and he told me something that made my chest tight. He'd hired his own private investigator 2 years ago to check on the Bio family because something about them had felt off. He'd found the debt, found Chloe's shoplifting record, found evidence that they were in serious financial trouble, but he hadn't found any evidence of fraud planning back then, so he'd kept quiet about what he'd discovered. Now he felt guilty for not pushing harder to warn me, for not showing me the evidence of their money problems and their questionable behavior. His voice was thick with regret when he said maybe if he'd spoken up sooner, I wouldn't have been blindsided by their betrayal. I stopped walking and turned to face him, seeing the genuine guilt in his expression. He'd been trying to protect me in his own way, gathering information but not wanting to seem like a jealous brother trying to sabotage my relationship with my biological family. I understood that impulse completely. I told Daniel the truth I'd been coming to terms with in therapy. I wouldn't have believed him 2 years ago, even if he'd shown me everything his investigator had found. I'd wanted the biological family connection so badly that I was ignoring every red flag myself, explaining away their weird money questions and uncomfortable comments. I'd been so desperate to find where I came from that I'd convinced myself their interest in my adoptive family's wealth was just natural curiosity. Dr. Simmons had called this a normal adoption response during our sessions, this desire to find where you came from even when the reality doesn't match the fantasy. Adopted kids often idealize their biological families, project all their hopes and dreams onto people they barely know. I'd been doing exactly that, building this imaginary version of Ava and Keith and the twins and Chloe in my head that had nothing to do with who they actually were. Daniel listened quietly, then pulled me into a hug right there on the sidewalk. He told me he loved me and he was sorry I'd been hurt, and I realized how lucky I was to have a brother who'd cared enough to investigate potential threats to me, even when doing so made him feel guilty. Kurt called Tom the following Tuesday with another update. The trial date had been set for 3 months away, and he wanted us to know the evidence against the Bio family was overwhelming. Phone records, email logs, security footage from the solicitor's office, recorded conversations, financial documents showing their debt and their research into my trust fund. The Crown Prosecution Service had built a case so strong that Kurt expected them to change their pleas to guilty before the trial actually happened. Their solicitor was apparently trying to negotiate the best possible deal, but the prosecution wasn't offering much leniency. The coordination and premeditation made this a serious criminal conspiracy, not a desperate impulse crime. All 5 of them had worked together, planned together, lied together. The evidence showed months of preparation and multiple coordinated attempts to steal a significant amount of money. Kurt explained that their solicitor would likely advise them to plead guilty and hope for reduced sentences, rather than go to trial and definitely lose. Tom thanked him for the update and hung up looking satisfied. 3 months until trial, 3 months of waiting to see if they'd admit their guilt or force us to sit through a full prosecution. I didn't know which outcome I wanted, whether I hoped they'd take responsibility or whether I wanted to see every piece of evidence laid out in court for everyone to witness. Part of me wanted them to face the full weight of a trial, wanted a judge and jury to hear exactly what they'd done and how they'd planned it. Another part of me just wanted it to be over, wanted to move forward without having to relive every moment of their betrayal in a courtroom. Linda said we'd deal with whatever happened when it happened, and for now we should just focus on staying safe and moving forward with our lives. Kurt called the next day with news that Helen had accepted a plea deal. She would testify against Ava about the hospital administrator impersonation in exchange for a suspended sentence. The prosecutor wanted her testimony to show the family's coordination and planning. Tom listened to Kurt explain the details while I sat at the kitchen table feeling numb. The biological family's united front was falling apart as each person tried to save themselves. Helen was Ava's sister, someone who'd been at family dinners when I visited Manchester, and now she was agreeing to testify against her own sister to avoid prison. Kurt said this happened often in conspiracy cases when the evidence was overwhelming. People started making deals to minimize their own punishment. Ava would face the full weight of the charges now without Helen's support or loyalty. 2 days later, a police officer delivered a letter that had been forwarded through the investigation. The envelope had Chloe's handwriting on it, careful and neat like she'd taken time with each word. I opened it in my bedroom with the door closed. She wrote that she was sorry and that her parents had forced her to participate in everything. She claimed she didn't understand it was wrong until the police got involved. She said she was scared and young and just did what her mom and dad told her to do. The letter went on for 3 pages about how frightened she was of prison and how her whole future was destroyed. I read it twice, then brought it downstairs to show Tom. He called Kurt immediately and read the letter over the phone. Kurt said it was likely a strategy to help her case given her age. The prosecutor would see it as an attempt to distance herself from the adults and claim she was manipulated. But Kurt also acknowledged that Chloe was only 14 when this happened, and teenagers did make terrible choices under parental pressure. I wanted to believe some part of her apology was real, that maybe she actually felt bad about trying to steal from me. But I also remembered her showing up at Mr. Whitmore's office pretending to be me, remembered the receptionist describing how confident and prepared she'd been. That didn't sound like a scared kid being forced to participate. The following week brought more news from Kurt. Keith had been formally charged with embezzlement from his accounting firm. The investigation Tom had triggered found years of small thefts from client accounts. Keith was losing his accounting license permanently. Ava faced professional misconduct charges related to the medication theft from the medical practice. Those charges would prevent her from working in healthcare again. The twins were banned from the entire restaurant chain and facing their own fraud charges for the betting scam Tom's colleague had uncovered. Kurt laid out each charge methodically, explaining the likely sentences and permanent consequences. Tom's campaign of professional destruction felt complete. Every member of the biological family faced criminal charges, lost their jobs, and had their futures completely derailed. I should have felt satisfied or vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired. That evening, I found Tom in his study going through paperwork related to the case. I asked him if he felt satisfied now that their lives were comprehensively ruined. He looked up at me with eyes that still held the same cold fury from weeks ago. He said he wouldn't feel satisfied until they were convicted, and I was completely safe from them. His protective anger hadn't diminished at all despite everything he'd already done to them. I realized then that Tom needed this justice as much as I did, maybe more. He needed to know that the people who'd tried to hurt his daughter faced real consequences. He needed to use every bit of his power and influence to make sure they understood you don't target his family without complete destruction following. Linda came in and put her hand on Tom's shoulder, and the 3 of us sat there in silence for a while. The trial was still months away, but Tom was already planning what he'd say in his victim impact statement. 2 months before the scheduled trial date, their solicitor contacted Tom's solicitor with a final offer. The biological family would plead guilty to all charges and accept restraining orders in exchange for Tom providing character references for sentencing leniency. The prosecutor had apparently made it clear that a trial would result in maximum sentences given the overwhelming evidence. Their solicitor was trying to salvage whatever minimal leniency might be available. Tom's solicitor explained the offer over the phone while we all listened. Tom said he would consider it only if they allocated guilty pleas and made full admissions of their planning and coordination. He wanted them to admit in legal documents exactly what they'd done and how long they'd been planning it. No minimizing, no excuses, just complete acknowledgement of their fraud conspiracy. The solicitor said he'd communicate those terms. 3 days later, Kurt called to say the biological family had accepted Tom's terms. They would plead guilty and provide full written statements admitting everything. The prosecutor was sending over copies of their formal statements for us to review before the plea hearing. Those documents arrived by courier the next afternoon. I sat on my bed with 5 separate statements spread out in front of me. Each one was typed and signed, legal admissions of guilt that would become part of the permanent court record. I started with Keith's statement because somehow reading his felt less painful than reading Ava's. He admitted researching Tom's career and wealth before Ava contacted social services to arrange our first meeting when I was 17. They had deliberately waited until I was old enough to potentially access my trust fund, but young enough to be manipulated emotionally. The timing of their approach had been calculated for maximum exploitation potential. Every word was clinical and precise, required legal language that made the betrayal feel even more calculated. Keith wrote that he'd spent weeks researching trust fund access procedures and security protocols. He'd studied Tom's professional background to understand his connections and influence. He'd planned which family member would attempt which type of fraud based on their individual skills and access. Reading his statement destroyed any remaining possibility that this had been a desperate impulse decision. Ava's statement was worse. She revealed she'd given up 3 children for adoption, not just me. I had 2 other biological siblings somewhere that I'd never known about. Ava had hired an investigator to track down all 3 of us after her financial situation got desperate. The investigator found that my other biological siblings had been adopted by families without significant wealth, so Ava never bothered pursuing relationships with them. She only contacted me because the investigator's report showed Tom's banking career and our family's financial stability. The investigator had even estimated the likely value of any trust funds based on Tom's public financial disclosures. Ava had literally selected me for contact, based on a cost analysis of which adopted child would be most profitable to reconnect with. She wrote in her statement that she never intended to maintain a long-term relationship with me after obtaining the trust fund money. The plan had been to get the money, then gradually reduce contact and disappear. I was never family to her, never even a person really. Just a financial opportunity she'd researched and targeted with the same calculations someone might use to plan a business investment. I spent my entire next therapy session with Marley crying about how I'd been selected for contact, purely based on money. Marley handed me tissues and let me sob through most of the hour. She said the transactional nature of everything was destroying my sense of identity and belonging in ways that would take time to process. I'd spent 4 years building a relationship with people who'd viewed me as nothing more than a potential source of money from the very first meeting. Every conversation, every family dinner, every text message had been part of a long-term fraud scheme. Marley helped me understand that my desire to connect with my biological family had been completely normal and healthy. The problem wasn't my need to know where I came from. The problem was that Ava and Keith were criminals who'd exploited that need for financial gain. But knowing that intellectually didn't stop the crying or the feeling that something fundamental about my identity had been shattered. The twins' statements showed they'd practiced impersonating me and Tom for weeks before making their first fraud attempt. They'd recorded themselves repeatedly, working on getting the voices right and memorizing details about our lives from social media. Jason had created a whole notebook of information about me, including my childhood stories that I'd shared on Facebook and Instagram. Riley had done the same for Tom, studying his professional history and personal details. They'd rehearsed their phone calls like actors preparing for a performance, critiquing each other's impressions and refining their approach. The level of effort they'd put into the fraud scheme somehow hurt more than if it had been an impulsive, desperate act. This wasn't a family in crisis making a terrible split-second decision. This was months of coordinated planning, practice, and preparation to steal from someone they pretended to care about. I read their statements twice, looking for any hint of remorse or acknowledgement that they'd hurt me as a person. But the statements were just cold admissions of criminal acts, legal requirements they had to fulfill to get their plea deal. They admitted what they'd done but showed no understanding of what they'd destroyed. Chloe's statement sat on top of the pile, and I made myself read it last. She wrote about how the whole thing felt like a game at first, like they were pulling off something clever and exciting. She described practicing her impersonation of me in front of the mirror, trying on different outfits to look the part when she showed up at Mr. Whitmore's office. She thought it would be fun to trick the solicitors and get the money, like something out of a movie. She never understood she was stealing from a real person who'd tried to be her sister. Reading her words made my stomach twist because she was just 14, young enough that maybe she didn't fully get what they were doing. But she also wrote about being excited to spend the money, about what she'd buy with her share once they got it. She saw me as a target, not family. And that realization hurt worse than anything Keith or Ava had written. Her age made her less guilty in the eyes of the law, but knowing a teenager thought stealing from me sounded like an adventure made me feel sick for days after. The sentencing hearing got scheduled for Manchester Crown Court 3 weeks later. Tom, Linda, Daniel, and I drove up together on a cold morning in early November. The courthouse was this massive old building with stone columns and security checks at every entrance. We had to go through metal detectors and put our bags through scanners before they let us into the courtroom. The biological family was already there when we arrived, sitting on the opposite side with their solicitor. Ava looked thin and tired, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Keith kept his eyes on the floor, his shoulders hunched forward like he was trying to make himself smaller. The twins sat beside them in cheap suits that didn't fit right, and Chloe was at the end of the row next to a social worker. None of them looked at us when we walked in and took our seats behind the prosecutor. The judge came in at exactly 10 o'clock, and everyone stood up while he settled into his chair at the front of the courtroom. He was an older man with white hair and reading glasses that he kept pushing up his nose. The clerk read out the charges against each of them, listing the fraud attempts and conspiracy counts in this formal legal language that made everything sound even more serious. Keith and Ava each got 2 years in prison, and I watched Ava's face crumple when the judge said the words. The twins got 18 months each, and Jason actually started crying right there in the courtroom. Chloe got a 12-month supervision order with 200 hours of community service because of her age, and the social worker beside her put a hand on her shoulder when she started shaking. The judge spent almost 10 minutes explaining his reasoning for each sentence. He talked about the level of planning involved, the coordination between family members, and the breach of trust they'd committed. Then he mentioned Tom's victim impact statement specifically, reading parts of it out loud to the courtroom. He described how the fraud attempts had destroyed our family's sense of safety, how I'd spent months building a relationship with people who only saw me as a source of money. He talked about the psychological harm of being targeted by biological relatives who were supposed to care about me. Hearing the judge acknowledge that this wasn't just about money made something loosen in my chest. The justice system understood what they'd really done. They hadn't just tried to steal funds from a trust account. They'd exploited my desire to know where I came from, weaponized my need for biological connection, and treated me like a financial opportunity instead of a person. The judge called it a profound betrayal of family bonds, and I felt Tom squeeze my hand when those words echoed through the courtroom. After the sentencing came the restraining orders. The judge issued orders prohibiting any contact between the biological family and me, Tom, Linda, or Daniel for 5 years. They couldn't call, text, email, or approach us in person. They couldn't contact us through third parties or try to reach out on social media. The orders covered Mr. Whitmore too, protecting my trust fund from any future manipulation attempts. The judge made it clear that violating the restraining orders would result in immediate arrest and additional criminal charges. I watched the biological family's solicitor explain the terms to them. Saw Ava nodding while tears ran down her face. Keith just stared straight ahead like he'd checked out completely. The twins whispered to each other until their solicitor told them to be quiet. Chloe kept her eyes on her hands, picking at her fingernails while the social worker took notes on a clipboard. When the judge finally dismissed the court, security officers came to take Keith, Ava, and the twins into custody. They'd be transported to their respective prisons that afternoon. I watched them get handcuffed and let out through a side door, and Ava looked back at me one last time before she disappeared. I couldn't read her expression, couldn't tell if it was regret or anger or just exhaustion. Walking out of the courthouse felt surreal. The cold November air hit my face and I realized I'd been holding my breath for the last hour. Tom put his arm around me and steered me toward the car park, while Linda and Daniel followed behind us. We were halfway across the lot when Tom stopped walking and turned to face me. He said he was sorry for how brutal his retaliation had been, for using his professional connections to systematically destroy their lives before the legal system could handle it. He told me he couldn't stand watching people hurt me and get away with it, that his protective instinct had overridden his usual measured approach to problems. His voice cracked a little when he said he hoped his actions hadn't scared me or made me think less of him. I could see the worry in his eyes, the fear that he'd gone too far and damaged our relationship in his rush to protect me. I told Tom I was grateful for his protection, even though his methods had scared me sometimes. I understood his fury came from love, from being a father who couldn't tolerate seeing his daughter exploited. Linda stepped closer and added that our family would always protect each other, that loyalty and love were what made us real family. Biology didn't create the bond we shared. Choice did. Tom and Linda had chosen to adopt me as a baby, chosen to give me the same trust fund as Daniel, chosen to support my relationship with my biological family, even when they had doubts. That choice, repeated every day for 21 years, meant more than any genetic connection ever could. Daniel nodded and said we were family because we chose to be, not because we had to be. Standing in that car park outside the courthouse, I felt the weight of the past 6 months start to lift just a little bit. Daniel took me for coffee after we got back to Surrey. We stopped at this little cafe near our house that made excellent lattes, and we grabbed a table by the window. He asked me how I was really doing. Not the polite surface-level question, but the deep one about whether I was okay after everything. I told him I didn't know yet, that processing the betrayal would probably take years. He said watching me get hurt had changed him, made him realize how much he loved me as his sister. He'd always known we were siblings, but seeing someone target me for being adopted made him understand how much our bond actually mattered. He promised he'd never take our family connection for granted again, that he'd always have my back no matter what. We talked for almost 2 hours, finishing our coffee and ordering more, just being brother and sister in the way we'd always been, but with a deeper appreciation for what that meant. When we finally left the cafe, I felt closer to Daniel than I ever had before. Dr. Simmons helped me work through everything over the next several weeks. I went to therapy twice a week at first, then dropped down to once a week as things got easier. We talked about family and identity, about what it means to belong somewhere and to someone. She helped me understand that biology doesn't create family. Love and loyalty do. Tom and Linda had chosen me, raised me, protected me with everything they had. That made them my real parents in every way that mattered. Daniel was my real brother because we'd grown up together, because he'd stood by me through this nightmare. The biological family had proven they weren't family at all, just people who shared my DNA and saw that as an opportunity to exploit. Slowly, painfully, I started to accept that truth. I stopped feeling guilty about their prison sentences and job losses. I stopped wondering if I should have given them money when they first asked. They'd made their choices, and those choices had consequences. I was allowed to be angry about the betrayal without feeling responsible for their suffering. My 21st birthday arrived 3 months after the sentencing, in early February. Tom and Linda threw a small celebration at home with just our family and Mr. Whitmore. They decorated the dining room with balloons and ordered my favorite food from the Indian restaurant in town. Mr. Whitmore showed up at 7 with a briefcase and a birthday card, and after we ate dinner, he presented me with the paperwork giving me full access to my trust fund. I could withdraw money for education, housing, investments, whatever I needed. The fund had grown over the years to almost £90,000, money Tom and Linda had carefully saved and invested since I was a baby. I felt emotional looking at the numbers, knowing how hard Mr. Whitmore and Tom had worked to protect it from people who saw it as something to steal. Tom raised his glass and made a toast about family and trust and moving forward. Linda cried a little bit, the happy kind of crying that comes from relief and love. Daniel gave me a hug and whispered that I deserved every penny. Mr. Whitmore shook my hand formally and said he was proud of how I'd handled everything with grace and strength. I decided to use part of my trust fund to pursue a master's degree in social work. I'd been thinking about it for weeks, about how I could turn this painful experience into something meaningful. I wanted to help other adoptees navigate the complicated emotions around biological family contact. I wanted to work with families dealing with exploitation and manipulation. I wanted to make sure other people didn't fall into the same trap I had, believing that biology automatically meant love and loyalty. Tom and Linda were proud of me when I told them my plan. They said turning pain into purpose was the best kind of healing, that helping others would help me process what I'd been through. Daniel said I'd be amazing at social work because I understood both sides now, the adoptive family perspective and the complicated feelings about biological connection. Mr. Whitmore offered to write me a reference letter for my graduate school applications, and I accepted gratefully. The application deadline was in April, giving me 2 months to put together my materials and write my personal statement. For the first time since the fraud attempts began, I felt hopeful about the future. I got my acceptance letter to the London School of Economics graduate program in social work 3 weeks ago, and Tom framed it like he'd framed my GCSE results years ago. Linda cried when I showed her, the good kind of crying where she kept hugging me and saying how proud she was. Daniel drove home from Cambridge that weekend to celebrate, bringing champagne and takeaway from my favorite Thai place. We sat around the dining table like we had for every important moment in my life, and I felt this deep sense of rightness about where I was and who I was with. The biological family was serving their sentences in different facilities across England, and I hadn't thought about them in weeks. The restraining orders meant I'd never have to see them again, and that knowledge brought me peace instead of sadness. Dr. Simmons had helped me understand that accepting their absence wasn't giving up on family. It was choosing the family that actually loved me. My first day of classes started in September, and I threw myself into the coursework with real purpose. The other students in my program had their own stories about why they wanted to help families, and I found myself sharing mine without shame or guilt. I told them about being adopted, about the biological family's betrayal, about learning what real family meant. My professor said my personal experience would make me a better social worker. That understanding both sides of adoption gave me insight most people never developed. Daniel and I planned a weekend trip to Edinburgh to celebrate both of us moving forward with our lives. He'd just gotten his first job offer from a tech company in London, so we'd be living in the same city again. We booked a cheap hotel near the Royal Mile and spent Saturday climbing Arthur's Seat, laughing about how out of shape we both were. That night, over dinner at a pub, Daniel told me he'd always been scared of losing me to the biological family, that he'd worried I'd choose them over him once I got to know them. I told him he was my real brother, that biology meant nothing compared to growing up together and having each other's backs. We walked back to the hotel through the old city streets, and I thought about Tom and Linda's decision to adopt me and give me an equal trust fund to Daniel. They'd made me truly part of their family from the beginning, treating me exactly the same as their biological son. That gift wasn't about the money in my trust fund. It was about showing me every single day that I belonged with them completely. The trust fund was just proof of something I'd always known deep down, that I had parents who loved me unconditionally and a brother who'd stand by me through anything. That was worth more than any amount of money could ever be.